Chapter 7. Intrigue in Athens. The sun was low by the time they reached the Acropolis, and the city was hidden in a copper haze. But from where they stood, high above Athens, the slanting rays bronzed the magnificent Doric columns of the Parthenon, and Indy gazed in awe. I grew up thinking Greece was a legend. Dorian laughed. I think I hear echoes of your father. His bedtime stories were about the feats of Zeus, Heracles, Poseidon, Hermes, and all the others. Medusa, the Gorgons, Jason and the Argonauts. I heard about 'em all. Well, that sounds like a wonderful childhood, she said, hooking her arm through his. Yeah, real swell, he thought, but he didn't disagree with her. Not now. He took in a deep breath, as if the magical air surrounding the bastion could somehow preserve the moment. What do you think is the single most amazing thing about the Acropolis? She asked. He thought back to her lectures, but drew a blank and shook his head. That any of it still exists, she said, and explained. The Turks stored ammunition in a building called the Propylaea, and one day in 1645 it exploded. 42 years later, the Venetians blew up the Parthenon. The only reason it still remained was that early 19th century archaeologists restored it to what they believed had been its appearance in the 5th century BC. Now you sound like the professor again. He smiled as he said it, just to show her he didn't mean it as a criticism. This must be a very special place for you. It is, of course, but actually my favorite place in Athens is the Tower of the Winds in the Roman Agora, especially at dawn. I'll have to see it sometime. Indy gazed over the city below them in the fading light. Great place to be an archaeologist. All the best ruins are right in your backyard. He expected her to laugh. She didn't. Archaeology grew up around this country just as European civilization did. They moved from the massive columns of the Parthenon and walked over to the Erechtheum, the only other surviving building. So why do you teach in Paris? I'd think you'd prefer to be here. That's complicated. You have to understand that we Greek archaeologists tend to favor the aesthetic aspects of the science. Rather than dirtying ourselves in pits looking for pottery fragments, most of us prefer to study the great works of ancient sculpture. In fact, the chairman of archaeology in all our major universities is actually the chairman of the history of sculpture. Really? Why is that? It's a way of compensating for the fact that we are economically and socially behind the northern countries which drew on our legacy. We've only been independent for 90 years, you know, after 4 centuries of foreign domination. So by focusing on the aesthetic aspects of archaeology, we ever so slightly elevate our present culture. You agree with that approach? No, but I understand it. I teach in Paris because it's easier to take a broader approach to the field. They stopped in front of the Erechtheum and examined the caryatids, a series of stone maidens who served as pillars on the building's southern porch. The last rays of the sun danced across the faces of the stone goddesses. Behind them, light and shadow eddied across the porch. For an instant, Indy thought he saw someone standing near the base of one of the statues. You remind me a bit of another student, she said, speaking in such a soft voice that Indy almost thought she was talking to herself. He was from England. When he came here, he had no sense of our recent history. He knew that Lord Byron died at Missolani. That was it. She was quiet a moment, and Indy waited for her to continue. We should get going, she finally said. The first lights winked on in the dusky haze over the city. Indy nodded, but his attention was drawn back to the Erechtheum. He peered as best he could into the inner recesses of the porch. The light shifted, the glare vanished, and now he could see the porch clearly. There was someone there. No, two people, two men, and they were peering out at them. That's odd. What? Dorian asked. There's two guys up on the caryatids watching us. Dorian swung around, his feet stabbed her in the back. I don't see anyone. They moved back now. Dorian took hold of his arm. Come on. He didn't know what the hurry was, but he followed her back towards the Parthenon. Below it was a path leading to the road where horses and buggies waited. In Athens, there was a mix of carriages and automobiles, whereas in Paris, autos prevailed and horses were a rarity. It was as if Athens couldn't quite decide whether to join the 20th century. Dorian tugged on his arm again. Indy, they're coming after us. He glanced back. The two men were moving towards the Parthenon, one a few yards ahead of the other. Why do you think they're after us? They're probably just a couple of tourists. Look again. The men had closed the gap. They weren't quite running, but they weren't bothering to disguise the fact that they were in a hurry. Let's wait. They're probably not interested in us at all. Dorian grabbed him by the arm. Don't be a fool. Run! They charged forward, hurrying over the rocky escarpment. Indy felt foolish. He still doubted the men were chasing them. He stumbled and almost pulled Dorian down on top of him. A white-hot pain shot through his ankle. Damn it! Hurry, Dorian hissed. He winced as he pushed off the ground and hobbled after her. The shadows had turned to deep purple, making it more difficult to see. They scraped their arms on the heavy thicket as they descended the path. His ankle throbbed and screamed with each step. He kept glancing back, but couldn't see anyone pursuing them. The ruins were nearly empty, and a lone carriage waited at the bottom of the path for stragglers. Dorian rushed over to it, waving her arms at the driver. The man calmly opened the door for her. Indy reeled across the road, limping as he ran. You all right, sir? The driver asked. Fine. Let's go. As the carriage pulled away, Indy glanced out the window into the dusky night. He glimpsed the men just as they reached the road. They stopped and stared after the carriage as it pulled away. They were probably just after the last carriage, not us, he said. She didn't answer. Dorian's house was located on a hill in an old neighborhood called Montasatiraki. I apologize for the pronunciations. I'm not good with Greek. Where at any time of the day you could look up and see the Acropolis hovering in the sky like a temple of gods. The house was quaint in appearance, with pilasters at the corners, a tile roof edged with terracotta goddesses, and a small yard protected from the street by a wrought iron fence and an abundance of vegetation. Not bad, Indy thought, as they entered the house, and he smelled dinner cooking. She'd come home after 2 years, and it was as if she'd never left. She had another life here that had continued despite her absence. Not only was dinner being prepared by the housekeeper, but a bubble bath awaited Dorian. While she bathed, Indy sat on the bed soaking his swollen ankle in a pail of cold water. Hey, Indy, Dorian called. He looked at the bathroom door. Yeah? Bring your pail in here so we can talk. Good idea, he thought. He did want to talk to her, and, hey, why not do it while she bathed? A mischievous smile turned on his lips as he raised his foot from the pail. How come I didn't think of that? He set his pail down next to the bathtub and sat on a chair draped with a towel. On the floor next to the tub was a bottle and a wine glass. Dorian held a half-full glass in her hand. Help yourself to some Racina, she said as he lowered his foot into the pail. Thanks. What is it? A wine made from pine sap. Pine sap? He poured himself a glass, sipped it, and made a face. Dorian laughed. It grows on you, believe me. It's very popular. Some people say too popular. You just have to be careful not to overindulge. He took another sip. His eyes strayed from her face. The sight of her soaking amongst the bubbles with one leg stretched languidly over the side reminded him of their recent tryst. He saw them entwined in her berth on the train, their movements synchronized with the rattle of the rails below them. Their love-making seemed almost surreal now, not like a real memory at all. He still found it hard to believe how rapidly the Lady Ice of Paris had melted in his arms. Yet here he was, casually watching as she bathed. Everything since then seemed like a blur to him. They'd left the train yesterday morning and spent most of the day on the ferry. When they'd reached the ports of Piraeus, they'd taken a taxi to Athens. They'd arrived exhausted and slept 12 hours. Today, while Dorian had busied herself with details for the trip to Delphi, Indy had explored the city on his own. First, he'd dutifully spent the morning at the archaeology museum. Later, he'd simply wandered around, taking in the sights. So, what do you think of Athens? She asked. I like it, but I can't stop comparing it to Paris. And what have you concluded? She stretched one of her legs, toes pointed towards the ceiling. The texture of life was different here, he decided. The beauty of Paris was seen through the subtle changes in the quality of light. Here the light was harsher, brighter, a contrast to the craggy landscape. Greece is earthy, fertile. France is more intellectual, refined. I agree. Both cities were tied to the past, but the past affected each city in different ways. Paris thrived as a center of artistic culture, a creative offspring of past artistic triumphs. Here, even though the past was everywhere, the culture that had flowered was now dormant. Paris was a sculpture still being defined. Athens was a monument, and its people could only stand by and watch it slowly deteriorate. Yet, in spite of living in the shadows of their forebears, the Greeks still seemed to excel in spirit. He saw them as a gregarious, talkative people who openly expressed their emotions, whether joy, anger, or sorrow. Most of the men were dark, curly haired, and handsome. They smoked black tobacco and drank endless cups of coffee while they absently fingered beads made of amber or silver. The women, however, seemed resigned to domestic drudgeries, and many wore black dresses as though they were in permanent mourning. He tried his best to explain his thoughts, but Dorian no longer seemed interested. Indy, I want to tell you why I thought those men at the ruins were after us. Good. I'd like to hear about it. First, I should tell you a bit about my family, she said, arcing her back as she watched the base of her neck and the rosy tips of her breasts push through the bubbles. Your family? It was difficult to concentrate on what she was saying. Yes, my family. You see, Greek peasant girls don't become archaeologists. My father is a shipbuilder and a large landholder. We even own a couple of islands. Entire islands? She laughed. Not large islands. He lives here, in Athens? He has an estate here, and houses in Rome and London. He's living in Rome right now, and he can't come home. Why not? Politics. She uttered the word like a curse. After Greece won her independence, there was no more nobility left, so those families who became involved in politics were the ones who became wealthy. That sounds pretty typical. Anyway, when the king decided to invade Turkey last year, my father took exception. He knew that it would end disastrously, and for speaking the truth, he was exiled. The bitterness in her voice was reflected in the tightness of her features. And is still in exile. Indy knew that the results of the war with Turkey were exactly what she said. As he understood it, Greece had invaded its neighbor with the hopes of freeing Greeks living outside of Greece. Now the city was flooded with refugees who had been forced from their homes in the conflict, and the loss of life had been extraordinary. I guess the invasion didn't solve anything, he said. What happened was a horrible mistake. We sent 100,000 men, and they're still being butchered. Indy nodded, unsure of what to say. He sipped his Retsina and watched her. You'd think we would have learned from the Great War. We suffered terribly in our support of Britain and France. The Greek people are tired of fighting, and now we're at it again. What does this have to do with the two men at the Acropolis? She rolled the stem of her glass between her fingers, gathering her thoughts. My father warned me not to come back until things settled down. He said it would be dangerous. So you think they work for the king? Possibly. Why don't they just stop you from working at the ruins? He asked. The king could certainly block me from returning to Delphi, but he is not a fool. Delphi is a national treasure, and it would look bad for him if he refused to allow me to go back, especially now after the earthquake. So you think they're dealing with you covertly, watching you to see what you're doing." She handed Indy her empty glass, motioning for a refill. "If they were only watching me, I would not mind. But I believe the king's men, if not the king himself, would like to hurt my father, and if I were killed, they would succeed." "What are you going to do?" "Nothing. We're leaving for Delphi tomorrow morning as planned. I refuse to be intimidated." Indy tipped the bottle, filling Dorian's glass in his own. He decided the Retsina wasn't so bad after all. He held out the glass to her and watched as she soaped one of her thighs with a round sponge. "Put the glasses down," she said, and slipped her hand around his neck. "What are you doing?" She pulled him to her, and Retsina spilled on the floor and in the tub. "I think you need a bath." Her voice was husky, soft, laced with laughter. She wound her wet arms around his back, and he toppled over the side, splashing into the warm bath as Dorian's soft limbs wrapped around him. "What about the maid?" "Don't worry." "And dinner?" "It'll keep." "I'm supposed to be the aggressive one," he sputtered, wiping his arms across his face as she tugged at his sopping clothes. "You're too slow. Besides, you could use a few lessons." "Okay, Professor." He peeled off his wet shirt. "I guess I'm still your student." And that's the end of the chapter. Hope you enjoyed it. Talk to you soon.